And so moving right along here in Joseph Campbell's Primitive Mythology, which is Masks of God, Volume 1, we are in the chapter that is based on examining the Paleolithic caves. And now we're moving to the second half of that chapter. Let's see, this was chapter 8. Chapter 8, the Paleolithic caves. So now we're dropping further back down in time to the Middle Paleolithic. Now, which occurs during the so-called Eemian Interglacial, which dates from about 100,000 years ago to about 115,000. This is an interglacial period. But first, before we get to the Neanderthals, Campbell begins by describing the ritual amongst the Ainu of Japan. Apparently, what he's doing here is outlining the circumpolar cult of bear worship. So all across from Finland and across from Siberia on into the Northwest Pacific Coast Indians and all the way over to Hudson Bay, there is practiced a reverence for the bear. The bear is one of the primary mythological animals in that zone, that circumpolar zone, which includes the Ainu of the northern islands in Japan of Hokkaido. And the Ainu are a Caucasoid race. They're not Mongolian. They're a little bit of a puzzle racially. They're very hairy, unlike the normal Japanese. The Japanese have certain racist issues with the Ainu because they're so hairy. But they have this ritual where they capture a live bear and they put it into a wooden cage and they raise it and play with it. But when it gets to be too large and starts to become a danger, it's time to sacrifice it. And they have this idea that the gods are so much in love with this world that they like to take on animal forms and come into the world. But the Ainu are going to do the god a favor. The god is trapped inside the bear and kill the bear to release the spirit and do it a favor, return it back to the other world. So what happens is they take the bear, put him in a cage. When it comes time to sacrifice him, they pull him out, they pin him down, and they shoot an arrow into his heart, strangle him. Then they remove his head, along with the pelt attached to it, lay it out, and give it offerings of its own flesh to it, and worship it with gratitude and piety and so forth. And it's all this wonderful stuff. And the fire goddess is called Fuji, and the fire goddess is part of the whole ritual. And so that's the Ainu bear sacrifice. And now, so he says, it's interesting that the earliest evidence that we have for the worship of a divinity of any kind seems to be the bear. In this case, the cave bear, which existed during the last interglacial period. And Emil Bakler was a man who excavated a number of caves that were available to Neanderthal man during the interglacial period. During the glacial period, the Vistchulian, which was the last ice age, which lasted from 150,000 years ago down to about 12,000 years ago, the caves were under ice, so they would not have been accessible during that period. So only in the interglacial period were they accessible. And he found at the cave of Drachenloch in Switzerland, he dug down a number of levels, and he found this very interesting level where there was this stone cabinet that had been designed with cave bear skulls on the inside of it, neatly arranged. He also found a cave bear skull with its thigh bones thrust through both of its eye sockets. And Campbell amplifies that by saying that there's a practice in Morocco when a panther is killed, the hunter has to pretend to sneak up on it, it's already dead, to sneak up on it and wrap a blindfold around its eyes in order to prevent the evil eye and the revenge of an unhappy spirit. So there may be a clue there to why the thigh bones are thrust through the cave bear skull. So apparently the Neanderthals were worshiping cave bears, even though this has been recently deconstructed and attacked, but it's attacked by scholars with an agenda who have come along with this so-called out-of-Africa migration theory that says now that modern Homo sapiens were not descended from Neanderthals, as was once had been thought, but actually came up out of Africa, since the oldest modern Homo sapiens now dates from the site of Herto in Ethiopia, which dates back to about 160,000 years ago. And they migrated out of there up through Palestine and then arrived about 45,000 years ago into Europe. And this theory states that no racial intermixing took place, that they just simply replaced the Neanderthal population. Very doubtful here. But the multi-regionalists counter them by saying, well, there is actual evidence of interbreeding. We have a certain dental nerve that Neanderthals had. The occipital bun on the backs of our skulls, Neanderthals also had, but the modern Homo sapiens in Herto did not have that. So there appears to have been genetic intermixing. What I think probably happened was genocide. You have to consider the fact that the Neanderthals had been in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, going back to Homo heidelbergensis, 600,000 years ago. And by the way, there was a recent site found at Atapuerca in Spain, dating back to the Lower Paleolithic, 300,000 years ago, of Homo heidelbergensis, who was the ancestor of Homo neanderthalensis. And apparently they found a pit called Cima de los Huesos, the pit of the bones, which was an opening in the floor through which the Neanderthals had been tossing their dead. The bones of over 30 individuals had been found intermixed. There was no evidence of any hearths down there or habitation, so it couldn't have been the result of a cave-in. So apparently, later Neanderthals liked to bury their dead in caves, almost always. And so here we have 300,000 years ago at Atapuerca in Spain, the earliest recognition of a disposal of the dead, throwing them down into this sort of hole in the earth, this vaginal womb tomb thing, perhaps, from which they will be reborn. And the Neanderthals, they'd been here since, in Europe, hundreds of thousands of years. And then by the time modern Homo sapiens arrives 45,000 years ago, within a mere 18,000 years, the Neanderthals are extinct. By 27,000 BC, they're gone. Moreover, we find at about that date, 26,000 BC, the skeleton of a young 4-year-old boy at Lagarvello cave in Portugal, I believe it is, who was the obvious result of genetic intermixing. He was part Neanderthal, part modern Homo sapiens. He had short legs and various Neanderthal characteristics, but also Cro-Magnon characteristics. So it does indeed appear that genetic interbreeding took place, and it's a standard scenario throughout history, and may possibly be the first time it occurred. When a new population moves in that has racist attitudes toward the local aboriginal inhabitants, very often they're just simply wiped out. The men are murdered through the process of ethnic cleansing, and the women are raped. That's probably what happened. I don't think this out of Africa nonsense that there was no genetic intermixing. That's just nonsense. It's not supported. Eric Trinkhaus at the University of New Mexico is one of the people who very clearly know that there was definitely genetic intermixing and interbreeding. So the out of Africa scholars have tried to deconstruct and dismantle Emma Bakler's findings of the cave bear skulls by saying that they're just chance arrangements. There's probably cave bears living in these caves, shoving bones around. Doesn't make any sense, though, especially since they've been found at multiple sites, also by other excavators like Konrad Herrmann at Petershöhle, who found 1.5 meters above the ground a series of 3 niches with cave bear skulls neatly placed within them. Hardly possible to be done by chance. And also Karl Ehrenberg in the 1950s also found evidence of Neanderthal worshipping cave bears. So it isn't just the one archaeologist. So the deconstruction of his stuff just doesn't work. Accusing him of sloppy archaeology and all that. Schliemann was a pretty sloppy archaeologist as well, so we might as well just go and deconstruct that and pretend that he never found Troy and that it was just a fabrication. I mean, the logic of these guys, when they're emotionally and politically motivated, it distorts all the evidence and just makes a mess out of everything. Deconstruction has gone quite far enough, I think, in this society. I'm getting more and more irritated with it as time goes by. And so the other thing we want to look at are these burials. The Neanderthals, the earliest burials, we have the Neanderthals, the Homo heidelbergensis, 300,000 at Atapuerca, but then the earliest actual inhumation seems to have been modern Homo sapiens in Palestine at a cave known as Kase, where was found the burials of about 15 or 20 individuals, and the most interesting of them is known as Q9, and it is a woman lying on her side with legs drawn up, and at her feet is an infant. There's not much in the way of grave gear buried with her, but the whole grave is sprinkled with red ochre. And this is the earliest use then of red ochre, which is found in graves going all the way across the old world. It's traded out in China for red cinnabar, which is basically the same thing. But the most convincing explanation, of course, is that it's a stand-in for blood, very possibly menstrual blood. since it was thought by ancients, and James Hillman talks about this in the Myth of Analysis, that it was thought by the classics, by Aristotle, that the woman stopped menstruating in order to use that blood to build the fetus. And very possibly there's a magical analogy here to the body sprinkling red ochre as menstrual blood that will be used to rebuild a new individual from that burial. Neanderthals did not use red ochre for their burials, except on a few isolated occasions later on when they start intermixing with the Cro-Magnons and they start picking up some of the Cro-Magnon techniques and so forth. And the next interesting burial, though, is a Neanderthal burial from Kabara cave, which isn't that far away from Kafsa in Palestine, where we find the remains of the most complete Neanderthal skeleton ever found, actually, except that the jawbone is left of the skull, but the cranium has been removed. So we don't know where the cranium is. And it's a Neanderthal affectionately named Mashi by its excavators. But it's interesting that the top half of the skull has been removed because later in the same region during the Neolithic at Jericho, there is a practice of revering the dead by removing the top half of the skull, leaving the jaw, and redecorating the skull, putting cowrie shells in for the eyes, and reanimating the dead ancestors in that fashion in that region. There's a lot of apparent interest amongst Neanderthals in the skull. At Monte Circeo in Italy, a Neanderthal skull was found broken up, with the back of it broken open, apparently to facilitate the eating of the brains, which is a practice done by the inhabitants of Borneo. I don't know if they're still headhunting there, probably not, but they were, and that was how they were getting access to the brains. There is evidence at a number of Neanderthal sites of cannibalism, incision marks found on bones to get the flesh off of human bones. So it looks like there was some kind of cannibalistic practice and possibly a reverence for the skull already amongst the Neanderthals, in addition to the cave bear worship. We have the skull cult, I think. And so then Neanderthal culture disappears by 27,000 BC. Now the Cro-Magnons, when they come in, are it is indeed true that they are much smarter. They're more gracile. They're lighter. Neanderthals are big. They have big, heavy bones, different kinds of muscles in their backs and shoulders to facilitate the throwing of spears. They're very tough, burly individuals. But the new species of modern Homo sapiens, also known as Cro-Magnon man, who comes in, is gracile and light, but also very intellectually refined. Whereas the typical Neanderthal site might contain 15 different types of tools, the typical Cro-Magnon site contains about 45 to 60 different tool types. And they liked to scrape in bone, which was something that the Neanderthals never really mastered as a medium. They didn't sculpt in bone with their stones and tools, or with their tools. But Cro-Magnon man did, and made all kinds of new types of tools. Tools for making tools, a concept not possessed by Neanderthals. Burins and scrapers, double-ended tools with a scraper at one end, a burin at the other. All kinds of new techniques. A new technique for making fire with a very Neanderthals would just make fire by digging a little pit, surrounding some stones with it, and lighting it. But Cro-Magnons created a different kind of pit with a draft, a thing dug into the bottom in order to bring in a draft. It's apparent that everything about the Cro-Magnons, the way they thought, was absolutely superior to the Neanderthals in terms of this kind of analytical intelligence. Their tool making is very sophisticated and requires a lot more steps and sequences than anything that the Neanderthals ever produced. So the Cro-Magnons came in. They were obviously very bright, very intelligent, very aggressive. And it's pretty clear, I think, that the Neanderthals' days were numbered when these guys showed up with that kind of intelligence. I don't think it's the case, as David Lewis Williams says in his book, The Mind in the Cave, where he says Neanderthals must have been congenital atheists, who, though they could make tools, obviously did not have any metaphysical ideas about the afterlife. That's wrong. That's part of that out of Africa attempt to deontologize the Neanderthal and make them appear as different as possible from modern Homo sapiens by animalizing them, basically, and reducing them to the status of animals, which they absolutely were not. There's lots of evidence of Neanderthal burials all over the place. Mount Carmel, Shanidar, in Europe at La Ferisie, Le Moustier, La Chapelle-aux-Saints. One of the burials at Mount Carmel, interestingly enough, of a Neanderthal individual was found buried with the jawbone of a boar, which is interesting because in that region, that's the myth that comes out of there of Adonis, who was killed by being gored by a boar. It comes out of that same region. It's where the way these myths echo over time. So no, there's no question that the Neanderthals were able to think metaphysically. They may not have had art that we know of, although there was a National Geographic article not too long ago in which the author, a woman, said that they were probably tattooing themselves with black manganese and using red ochre. There's also been evidence found of a Neanderthal bone flute. They may have invented music already with bone flutes. So they were more creative, I think, than maybe realized. But I don't think they were anywhere near as smart as modern Homo sapiens, and I think that was the death knell for them. So we have the evidence there for the earliest religiosity, the worship of the bear. The bear appears to be the earliest and oldest revered animal that we have any evidence for. And so Campbell finishes this chapter by contrasting the mythologies of the two worlds, the world of the hunters and the world, the equatorial zone of the planters that extends from West Africa, goes across through the Sudan and across the tip of India, Melanesia, Polynesia, and on to Brazil, in which we have the primary myth of the killed, sacrificed human being who is killed, who is the incarnation, not the representation, not symbolic of, but the actual incarnation of the primordial god, as in the Hainawali myth, who was killed, buried, and from the burial of her body, or its body, it might be the head of like Tatuna, for instance, from which the coconut palm grows, a plant erupts and grows. And that's that mythological world. And then in the north we have the world of the hunters, some of whom are also in the south, as we've seen, in which the primary myth is that of the covenant with the animal, the worship of the animal master, and the shaman communing back and forth between these two worlds. So that brings us to the end of that chapter, part 3, which puts us about 2/3 of the way through the book. Next is the archaeology of myth.